identify your shipments, the length of time it took, or how long it happened, and then present it and say, why are these keep getting held up? Here's a list of the entries that we're having concerns with.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Hey, Andy. So we're back on another episode. I mean, we're past our first anniversary here and still rolling, and really cool, really excited about this show. Number one, I'm going to learn a lot because I have no idea what the FDA have an idea, but I just never really followed them or looked at regulations in my career and having to do with that. But anyway, so it's going to be a learning podcast for me as well. So anyway, but we're bringing on new and different topics that include like OGAs, or I don't know, what do they call them? OGAs or PGAs? It's the same thing, I guess, but yeah.
It's if you say OGA, you're dating yourself, and the PGA is more okay. the current term.
Yeah. So anyway, so the PGA. So anyway, but Andy, I mean, you know more about this. He's your buddy and all. So.
Oh yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, folks. We are going to get to talk about some FDA related things. And it's one of those things where you were talking about not knowing much on the FDA. I didn't plan on getting as involved in FDA related items, but when I was at FedEx, there was a lot of issues that, from a regulatory and industry affair perspective, we were striving to try and make a difference. And the FDA, quite frankly, we're going to go through and talk about some things with somebody that definitely knows, he knows his stuff. I will say he's somebody that I have a tremendous amount of respect for. And I've always said this, Domenic Veneziano, he was the director of import operations at headquarters there with the FDA. And Dominic is one of those guys I think had to be the most loyal and phenomenal FDA employee there was. Because even though he may not agree with some of the direction, man, I'm tell you what, Dominic, man, you followed the orders and went right through it. But the one thing that I will say, and folks, let me tell you, Dominic knows his stuff. He's going to forget more than I'm going to learn. And that's one thing that it just, the depth of your knowledge, Dominic's phenomenal. But the other thing, even though we would get on some issues and you and I would have some intense debates, and I always enjoyed them because it's like, listen, we had two opposing views on something, or we would hammer something out. But the thing that was always so phenomenal is the level of respect you always paid to me. I just would always was, even though we may not agreed on an issue or something, we always tried to come to some kind of common ground or some working solution. And that was just a credit to you really having a passion to have a positive impact in the importing and exporting community. And I just always greatly appreciated that.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the invite to the podcast. I mean, I want to congratulate both of you. Much success in the work that you've done. And I've listened to a few, and they're great opportunities, and I think the industry owes you a lot putting this together, and it provides good information, and I'm happy to be here. And Andy, you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that I do miss about the agency is the interaction with the brokers and the industry overall in terms of, what you all do and the service that you provide to the United States in terms of getting products logistically from point of origin to the consumers. And you're right, we did have debates, and I actually learned a lot from those debates, and I loved them because, one thing I always realize is I don't know everything, right? I know one aspect of it, and that was the regulations, and that was the law, which I have to stand by. But the pressures that you guys handle in terms of the cost to demurs or to cost of logistics, it it was a good appreciation for me to listen to it, try to take in your input. And being Italian, I'm always loud anyway. So you and I, we would discuss and it would get loud and people thought we were fighting. And people used to walk by my office going, what's going on? And I'm like, we're just debating it. But it was good perspective in terms of the industry concept, and me taking it back and going to my staff and saying, this is what they need. Let's take a look at how we can work this out if there's something we can do. And, you may have not seen that aspect of it, but that's one thing we always try to do. And the Division of Import Operations does a tremendous job at trying to help the industry. And I thought that was my role. So I always enjoyed our conversations going back and forth. And believe me, I never took anything personal. I always thought it was in the best interest of the industry as well as the agency. So it only made me better. So I appreciate that interaction that we have.
Hi everyone, are you loving our podcast? Do you feel like watching instead of just listening to our episodes? We have started to share our podcast videos on our trade community, www.crowd.trade, where you can view the complete show, comment, and carry conversations with your peers. We have built a trade community around our training courses and different resources for you to collaborate and gain the knowledge you are looking for. Head over to crowd.trade and register for your free account. Let's start trading.
Oh man, I can remember there were times that, whether it was in person or would be on the phone or whatever, and you and I would be just, debating an issue, going at it, and like, oh, no, here we go. We can't do that. Or go pound sand. Wait a minute. We got to get it. And somebody's like, holy crap, you guys better settle down. And I'm like, and then, when it was all said and done, we're, getting a beer. Hey, how's the family, whatever. And they're like, I don't believe this.
It's like that cartoon from the again, dating myself, right? The coyote and the sheepdog. Do you remember that cartoon? They were both they're big buddies and everything. They're having a coffee. They clock in and they're both going at it, because the coyote wants to get the sheep and the sheepdog is getting. They clock out and they're like, see you tomorrow. Say hi to the wife. Have a good night.
That would be pretty good. It was one, though. I will say, though, we had, I think the efforts that we were looking at, there was an attempt to try and seriously from the private sector to bring things to the FDA to improve the clearance process and the cycle times. And that's what we were talking about, folks. Is that the FDA gets bombarded with volumes of line items from entries. And it's just the astronomical increase in line items and the staffing that it takes and whatnot and the coordination, all that. And we were looking at, well, how can we help the FDA? We're not trying to say cut corners. What we're trying to do is what can we do to help them become more productive, to improve cycle times and the entry process and all that. And one of the things that the private sector did, came up with a list of about 16 items or whatever it was. One of them as simple as the private sector was going to be willing to buy RAM memory chips. The processors you had were fine. The PCs in the field seemed to be fine, but they didn't have enough RAM memory to look at images. And so the poor field agent that's doing an on-screen review and looking at the images, it would just sit there and clock and stuff like that. And so, as we were trying to come across and say, hey, we can put, a few $100 and all of a sudden you could, triple the productivity of what's going on and things. And as we were bringing things to the floor, Dominic, you were very instrumental in trying to get upper management of FDA to say, listen, this isn't something they're trying to cut corners. This is something we're really trying to be an advocate for the FDA. And you were very helpful in some of those things. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's funny because, now that I sit on this side of the table, I get to experience a lot of the pain that you guys went through in terms of it. But the conversations we had then and me trying to go through the IT department and trying to get things approved and been utilized, Finally, I understand they made changes to it to get rid of that slowness, and it had to do with the software they were using, and they finally agreed to get rid of it. As of, yeah, I went out with a colleague for lunch the other day, and he finally said, yeah, they scrapped what they were using because they realized how slow it was. And I said, gee, it only took how long? I mean, it's been what, 10 years, I think, or at least 15 years before we were trying to do that a while ago, and they finally agreed to get rid of it and start with new software that speeds up the entire process so that when you're out in the field, it's a lot more seamless.
I think what we ought to do is stop for just a quick second, because Dominic, you were with the FDA for many years, and then I guess you've retired from the FDA and you have your own consulting company now. Is that not correct?
Yeah, I was part of the United States Public Health Service. I was stationed with the Food and Drug Administration. I started in 1992 and worked there for 24 years, and ended up as the Director of Import Operations. I retired in 2016 and opened up a company called Veneziano Consulting, where I pretty much do exactly what I did when I was with the agency. I try to help the industry navigate the import process and try to help them get products into the country as best they can, get off import alerts or anything associated with FDA. Do a lot of communication with the old staff as well to try to help the industry in terms of the communication aspects. I know that when I was there and continuing today, there is so many lines that they have to deal with and so much work that they have that just knowing who to contact, making a phone call to an old friend is a lot easier and quicker than going through the normal process. So I do that. I do a lot of work for the industry and trying to navigate through the system.
I will say for our listeners out there, we will have Dominic's contact information in our show notes and whatnot. But seriously, Dominic is a good resource if you're having questions with your FDA clearance process. If you have would like maybe to try and streamline some of that, or just get some answers and all that, Dominic would be a very good resource for you. With that, let me shift gears. There's some new regulations that's going on out there, and I'd love to. It's having to do with cosmetics. Cosmetics was one of those that used to be kind of, as I'd said off camera here, it just kind of a quick clearance pass. Oh, it's cosmetics, FDA, whatever, and then it would just be passed on through. But it appears the FDA seems to be getting a bit more, I would say, involved in the enforcement side on cosmetics and looking at them or planning on looking at it a bit more closely. Is that, can you give any kind of an update on what you're seeing on the new regulations?
I think overall, cosmetics was always kind of like the black sheep of the process. It's really the only thing that didn't have good manufacturing practices, and it only had really three requirements. I mean, it was labeling issues, health claims, and then color additives or additives to it to ensure that they were safe. And for the past, I don't know, many years, they've been trying to change and bring in regulations to bring it more up to speed with other commodities that FDA regulated. And recently, the Modernization of Cosmetic Regulation Act of 2002 just got finalized, and now they're in the process of bringing that back up to speed. So as of December 29th of this year, cosmetic manufacturers have to register with FDA and list their products with FDA. So that's more in line with like medical devices. And then starting, I believe it's in December of 2024, they have to comply with good manufacturing practices, which would include documentation, record keeping, adverse event issues, water quality, internal audits, and other things that bring it more in line with other commodities that FDA, ensures safety of. And now they'll be able to do inspections of those facilities based upon those regulations. So, yes,
Well, I was going to say, and with that, all right, so let's stop for a second. Is that with the FDA let's say a medical device or something, you have registration of the manufacturer, of the importer or the exporter, the product itself, those kinds of things. Is that kind of approach and level of detail going to be coming for cosmetic type commodities?
It's not that involved. So under the device requirements, you have the manufacturer, you have a device exporter, you have the importer. All of the parties have to register. In cosmetics, it's just going to be the manufacturer. So there's a lot of exemptions. So anybody who distributes, labels, packages, sells, holds, all of them are excluded from the registration requirements. So, as we talked about, Andy, it's, cosmetics is always kind of a less risky product than obviously medical devices or drugs. So it's not as stringent as a regulation as the others, but it's starting to get there where, they're going to be looking at and conducting inspections, more of a record related inspection, I believe, than a on-site inspection like the other commodities.
Well, it's one of those things where, and forgive my ignorance, it's been a while since I've looked at this, so my memory's pretty short here. I think you would consider cosmetics a type 1 type of a product where it's topical, and then you have, and I may be using the wrong term, and a type 2 is like it's ingested, and type 3 would be like a surgical type of item in
Yeah, and the medical devices, there's different classifications. Class 1 being the lowest risk, Class 2 being substantially equivalent, and then there's Class 3s that require pre-market approval. Cosmetics, there isn't really any approval process. So the only thing you'll have to do is do just that. The only thing that's really they're concerned with is especially products around the eyes. There's additives, color additives have to be approved prior to use. So there's things that are in cosmetics that are concerned that are approved by FDA, but the products themselves are just going to have to be listed and not actually approved like it is for medical device or pharmaceuticals.
Well, I guess I spent so much of my time when I was at FedEx and then doing other industry, Seva Logistics and other companies where I was spent a lot of time on medical devices and pharmaceuticals, and so I guess that could carry over to my ignorance here. Okay, so with that, if I guess to our listeners just for a second, so if you're dealing with cosmetics, basically, and or if to our brokers, listeners, if you are handling any of your clients has cosmetics, then you need to get up to speed on the new regulations and look at the new requirements. And basically, if you're an importer, you need to stop and take the time to look at what data you have. And correct me if I go wrong here, Dominic, is what data you have in your parts database regarding your cosmetic product, and look to see if you need to start adding additional data fields on those products and make sure you have everything there. So the purchasing and sourcing folks, the marketing folks, and the compliance folks all need to sit down and have a discussion and make sure you've got information because and that is current. Would that be a pretty fair statement there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the process, whether it's medical devices or whether it's cosmetics, is going to be the same. So if you don't have those data elements, and FDA really hasn't come out yet and identified what those data elements are, but you can anticipate they're going to be similar to other regulatory requirements. So other regulatory products. So if you're looking at, how information goes to Customs and Border Protection through their ACE system into FDA, if you don't have a registration number or a listed number of a product, it's very possible that that entry is going to get rejected. And then if it's incorrect, it'll come to FDA and FDA will detain it and make it subject to refusal. So I would think that you want to, contact your suppliers or the importers, if you're a broker, and try and let them know you need to start thinking about this information so that we're prepared come January of 2024 to stop providing that information to FDA if you're going to import cosmetics in the future. So, and I would imagine that, FDA usually gives a little leeway, but, it's very possible that they start enforcing as soon as possible. So I'd start.
I was just going to say you're making some good points in the scenario here. So let's shift gears here a little bit, because I'm going to talk about, I guess, medical devices only because I'm a bit more familiar with it. So, contrary to some of the other commodities that the FDA, regulates. But one of the things that I hear from importers, when it comes to the FDA, it seems like there's this, almost like a big barrier. It's like the big mystique about FDA and how to get, cleared, and they get a lot of things held up. And it's been a few years, my understanding, that since I did the study, but I know we were looking at some joint efforts in looking at what the FDA gets hit with. And it was my understanding that less than 25% of all the thousands of line items that were sent to the FDA received a systemic may proceed, which is like the system looked at it, everything's fine, and it goes through. That means 75% of all the line items that were transmitted to the FDA, the field offices, somebody had to do an on-screen review. Now, of that, they would go through and they would look at the information, whatever, process it. But it was basically a manual may proceed versus a systemic one. Okay. With that, then, as we're looking at it, I always wanted to look and say, okay, what is it? And I talk to importers, they get frustrated, and because things will get held up, and you can imagine it at peak times, volumes are going up, and so FDA personnel can only handle so much. And so people would get frustrated. And I would always look at them, and they're saying, well, what can we do about improving the clearance? And the importers would always say, well, I don't know, because I don't know what to do. And I said, well, have you ever stopped and sat down and, called the FDA personnel, go and talk to your center people and whatever? And I was shocked to find most people didn't do that, or they'd only go so far, and then that was about it. So with that, I'm going to say that I've always instructed some folks, and then I want you to take and pick this up, is that if somebody has some challenges with not getting timely clearance from the FDA, their products seem to constantly get held up, is to stop, take the time, get your information regarding your importer profile, regarding your manufacturer, all those kinds of things, and then schedule some time with the FDA and sit down and talk with them. So the question is, do you go to the field office, or should you go to one of the centers, or should you go to the headquarter folks, or where should you think people should start here, Dominic?
Well, it's a great question, Andy. I think overall, first of all, I think the agency's come a long way. I think some of the frustration you and I had early on is we didn't have the technology to allow that process to happen quick. And FDA it has come a long way where they have the predict system now that they can tweak. So if things get really busy, they can just push a button and things get may proceeded and only the things that they want. So they can manage it a lot better. But that happens all the time, and it still happens where with creation of AI, artificial intelligence now, and other types of technology, things do get held up. And they get held up, which is frustrating to me for my clients, because if you're being held up for one product from all of that manufacturer for that importer, that means nothing's going to your clients, and that's costing you a lot of money. So what we have done is figure out, all right, who do you have to talk to? And if you're looking at one port of entry, then my advice would be to go to that director of the port specific. So start with the director of import operations for that division. So it would be, Pacific or Southeast, Northeast, West Coast, and then talk to them and do exactly what you say. Identify your shipments, the length of time it took, or how long it happens, and then present it and say, why are these keep getting held up? Here's a list of the entries that we're having concerns with. Can you just look into these and tell us if we're doing something wrong or potentially meet with them? Now, if you're using multiple port of entries, then my advice would be to go to the Division of Import Operations and try to handle it at a higher level. Because one of the things that John Verbaten, who's the director up there now, the Deputy Director of Associate Commissioner of Import Operations, one of his goals with him and the director of the 5 divisions is to bring uniformity across the country, right? Which is what we've always strived for. And sometimes things go awry. But if he's not aware of it, then he needs to be. So I would reach out to him and his staff and then say, we're having a concern with consistency across the country of these shipments specifically getting held up for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and then present it in a logical way. And one of the things I've always found, both when I was with the agency and now that I'm outside the agency, is people are actually afraid to talk to us.
That's the one thing that always shocked me. I agree with that because they was like, oh, the FDA, they're scared to death. And it's like, no, they're just, they put their pants on like one leg at a time. Come on, guys.
Andy, you were never shot. that wasn't a concern with you.
Wait a minute.
But honestly, that's what we love. That's what I loved because, if there's issues, how do I know about it? If people aren't voiceful and bring them up to me. So, and I know John very well. I know he and I are great friends. He is the same way. If he doesn't know about the issues, he can't address the issues, and that's what the goal is.
Well, the only thing about John,
you were never shy about it.
The only thing about John is he was definitely much more quiet than you are. You and I would like,
he has his moments. So, but he's absolutely. I mean, he was a good mix. And I'll throw in Ted Poplowski. Ted Poplowski was my special assistant at the time. Extremely knowledgeable, still there. And a great resource if you ever need him. He's fantastic. So John himself and Allison Nicoli, who's now the Director of Import Operations, are great people to talk to if you ever have any issues.
Dominic, and that was a good point that you had because we recently had, do you know Cynthia Wittenberg from
I know
CBP?
Cynthia very well. She and I worked together when I was with the agency, and I still keep in touch with her today.
Well, she's like you, retired from the government, and she says the exact same thing. We interviewed her recently, and she said, I mean, we're there to help, and don't be afraid to reach out, and it's true, it's, and I've been meeting some more people since then. Like we just met those folks from the Census Bureau, right, Andy, and USDA. And from USDA.
Aaron from USDA, isn't it? That
and then and at the conference, and it was like, it's easier to approach them and, hey, let's talk, and whereas before you're like, oh, should I even bother them?
Well, let me say this, is that with the scenario, when you talk to them, I mean, I had such great admiration too with reaching out to the district directors, and I found they actually appreciated. I kind of bent over backwards for the industry because I was like, everybody's like, oh, no, we can't talk to them. I was like, why not? And I'm on the phone and talking to folks up in Buffalo or out in, Seattle or wherever, wherever it took. And it was, again, on behalf of the industry and trying to, work things through. But here's the one thing that I would say, that when you go and talking to, like, let's say you're talking to the district director and their staff regarding a particular port or at the headquarters, whatever level you're talking with, when you're bringing up the deal with the entries, the question that I always, so this is to our listeners now, is that if you're a service provider or if you are an importer, when you're saying, I've got a problem with these entries, what caused them to get hung up? And a lot of times they really don't know yet. All right. But, and then so they're kind of tap dancing a little bit. And so here's where I will always come back and say, okay, what would it take for these entries based on your knowledge? What would it take for these entries to have gotten a systemic may proceed? And almost 99% of the time, I would get a response back. I mean, you did it to me as well as others, and it was always, well, the FDA always has the right to inspect them. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that's never in dispute. I'm not challenging that. I'm challenging your system and your processes. And usually what happened when we finally got past the scenario where don't put up defenses, it's like, look, we're trying to fix this. I'm a good corporate citizen. I've registered everybody and their dog plus their firstborn on this process, and I'm still getting hung up. Why is that? And so then the FDA personnel really started looking at it going, well, there's an issue here. And what we discovered sometimes is that as we're striving things from the headquarters, the centers are the ones that set the parameters. The centers that have like the medical device center or the cosmetic, that they would set the parameters that the database that Predict worked off of. And I always said this, and I'm going to say it again too. You heard me say this. Predict was always touted as being a new system coming in, that it is a learning system, and that as time goes on, it would learn your imports, and it's supposed to increase that may proceed rate. And I said, well, if Predict is a learning system, it's the dumbest dang system I've ever seen. It's like, because it is not learning here. But what it came back to is trying to, reach out to the centers as well as the field office. And so, again, as you're looking through it, so it's going to take like peeling back the layers of an onion. There's so much information that gets sent to the FDA from multiple areas that as it comes to your product and your file, sometimes some of that stuff is in conflict. And if it is, it gets hung up until somebody can just push it along. And that's where I'm saying, I'm just saying, ask the question this way again. What will it take for these entries to have gotten a systemic may proceed? You don't want to jump on somebody and like it's going to take time to look at it. Now, let me take another step. What I discovered in one particular case, and it took us probably 8 months to get to this level. We had everybody was registered, had the registration numbers for different things and all that. It turned out that the information that the FDA got for registering a warehouse facility got mixed and switched with the information from, I guess, an importer or something. I don't know. It was like a different party. It was completely different. I'm like, and so the FDA said, well, you need to write this letter. It's like, wait a minute. It's your system. You put it in wrong. You guys need to fix it, But we finally got there, and it got, and man, I'm telling you, that stuff started going through there like greased lightning. It worked out really well. It was a win-win solution, and then they can put their expertise on what they needed to be focused on. So to that extent, what do you think about all that I've just said here?
I think it's a great point. One of the things I do for my clients is take a look at their products and make sure they have all the data elements, and we'll go through it and make sure that the 510K numbers, if it's a device or if it's a food, and it needs a SID number, which is a schedule ID number, make sure they have it before they do any of the work. So the information, it's data driven. So if the data is wrong, everything's going to get held up. And in your example, what was probably happening is it was going to the center's databases, which maintains the 510K numbers, the PMA numbers. Every center has their own, and Predict goes out, reaches out. So if any of that data is wrong, it cuts the line, right? And it goes to a human review. And then what happens is a human review has, I have X amount of work in my workload. It's going to take time. Then they ask you for, I need a purchase order, or I need a bill of lading, or I need the invoice. And that takes another, because you gave them that, it's another 5 days they have to review it. So now you're talking about a big delay in terms of the process. But I would do all the homework up front, Randy. And just like you said, have that knowledge, ask that question specific, And the other thing I would say, because it put me in a very bad position when I was with the agency. If you go to the field office and you don't like their answer, and then you go to Allison, Nicole, or John, they're going back to the field office. So they're going to support their staff. So, be cognizant of the way you ask things, the work that you do with them, and the communication between them, because it gets frustrating when all of a sudden you don't agree with their decision, you go above them, and all of a sudden it comes back down. Because I'm going to reach out to the staff, I'm going to ask what's going on. I will also say, though, what I'm finding is there's less flexibility now, I think, than there was back then. And I'll put it in this way. If there's a common sense issue that can't be resolved, I don't think people are looking at that as well as they have in the past. And an example would be that if everything is right, but there's a technical issue, and it's something that the laboratories or it's unique to FDA, the FDA is being really strict in terms of any flexibility. You're not going by the letter of the law. Now, guidance documents and procedures are just that. They're only guidances. They're not regulations. So I always looked at, Andy, when we had our discussions, what's a guidance, right? And what can I push, and what am I limited to based upon statute and regulations, where I have to come back and say, Andy, I can't do that unless it goes in front of Congress, right? So there is flexibility that I had that I could say, you know what, let this go. Or, let's work around these and figure out procedurally how we can make changes. Whereas statutorily, there are things that I couldn't do.
You are hitting on something, though, that I thought that I think is really good, is that, all right, there is, you can go to the field offices, and there are times that I did. I mean, I would be working on behalf of an importer, or even, as a service provider. I'm like, there's a process here and it doesn't seem to be working right. What's going on? And whatever the case may be. And so I'd talk with the field office, and let's say, there would be times I would get an answer that I didn't really agree with. And it's say, okay, look, I'm just going to let you know, I'm going to raise this issue up. I'm not trying to say, you're wrong and shame on you kind of thing. It's like, look, I think that you're interpreting the rules, or I'm following what the direction I'm getting. Great. I'm going to talk to the center and find out what seems to be digging this up, or I'm going to talk to headquarters. So just let you know, please don't, this isn't to, offend you or anything, but I'm going to try and get the rule changed or whatever. And as folks in the community, here's another issue. If you don't like the rule, don't break it, change the rule. And what I mean by changing it is, like, you need to work in the industry. We are strong advocates for working with trade associations, but also work, some of it may be legislative, so it has to be an act of Congress, as you just mentioned. Or it may be a bureaucratic thing to say, okay, we need to work on changing a regulation. But whatever the case is, always look at it from standpoint that, of trying to streamline the process and look at the intent. And it's like, hey, I have to comply with this. I may not like it. I can try and change the rule later, but for right now, I got to comply with this and go with it. So
It's absolutely correct. And that's a good way to approach it, because I think that the field and the managers in the field will respect the fact that you're letting them know, listen, I understand your interpretation. I don't see it that way, or I don't read the law that way. The preamble says one thing. Can we do it? And I'm dealing with it right now. There are situations that when I was with the agency, I helped write the foreign supply verification program. And there's things that I tried to implement at that time where the agency decided not to do it, but now they're impacting the trade because they didn't do what I thought was the right thing. Now, you and I you actually mentioned it earlier. They have the right to stop everything that they want to stop, right? It's under the law. They can examine everything. but sometimes it just doesn't make sense when the industry does everything right based upon other regulations, but then FDA does just the opposite of what the intention of the regulations meant. So it is frustrating at times, and I deal with it on this side now, and I have to try to fight to get my point across in terms of what makes sense to the industry and what was the intention when the laws were written. So yeah, it's frustrating, but I think if people appreciate that there's different interpretation, and they would respect the fact that you let them know that you're going to headquarters and not just do it behind their back.
Well, and again, look, people, importers, service providers, whatever, take the time to develop a relationship with those that you're dealing with, be it at customs, be it at FDA or any of the other agencies. And that was the one thing that I guess I would even call up some of the district directors and say, as a service provider, look, we have entries that come through ever so often. Here's our filer code and all that. Are there any issues that come up that you have questions on, or is there anything we can do to make it better for you, or how's it going, or hey, I'm going to let you know, we're going to be bringing in a truck or a flight into this port that's going to hit your volumes, or we're going to take a flight out of there, and so the FDA, and especially in the field, you're trying to balance out your staffing. And so they seem to appreciate it. But if you develop that relationship, then the scenarios when you really have a need, it's one of those things that, picking up the phone and calling, they're going to take your call. And, so that's one of those things where I can't say enough. As frustrated as I was on a lot of FDA related processes, I gotta say that the people that I had, getting to talk to and whatnot, were fantastic folks, great at all different district levels and at the headquarters and all that. So I would say this has been, I think, a good conversation as we go into it. And we're only really tapping the surface here of getting into some things. So one of the things I think it would be good is maybe talk about some case files in the future. But we need to have you back, Dominic, and say, okay, let's actually talk about something, and maybe it's like, what were they thinking, kind of a thing. We kind of go down that road where somebody was doing an infraction on something, and is like, what were they thinking? It's like FDA wise, I'm sure there's a lot of stories you could tell.
Yeah, I love it. And it'd be a great opportunity to come back and talk to you about that. I mean, there's a lot of things that we can deal with, and I think your advice of contacting FDA, getting to know, building relationships, best way to do it. That's what made me successful, I think, in terms of the industry, getting to know both customs, the industry, all the brokers, all the associations, the discussions behind the scenes, at conferences when you and I would just sit down away from people, talk about the issues that you have and come up with solutions. I mean, it was meaningful, and it lasts till today. So, you can always give me a call and discuss, and obviously a lot easier to do when you know somebody rather than just.
Yeah, and that's where I would say, again, folks, and this almost sounds like an advertisement for you, Dominic, but I'm going to tell you to our listeners, seriously, if you've got some issues with FDA, Dominic is a good resource. There's lots of folks out there that do, and I don't want to undermine them at all, but I will just say I have a lot of respect for this man. He knows his stuff. He is well respected within the agency still. And, but he'll the one thing I will say, Dominic, man, you will flat, part somebody's hair with a hatchet if they're going down the wrong way, man. It's like, this is not what you need to do.
Well, I don't know if I'd call it that, but it's a good point. I mean, I think one of the things my responsibility is to keep you out of trouble. I mean, you have to navigate the waters, right? And so I know how to get things done in one way or the other. So I don't, 24 years I dealt with public health. I'll never go against public health, but sometimes the agency gets things wrong, right? And there's ways to do things. So part of my advice is, no, you shouldn't do that. This is going to get you in trouble. Or, yeah, you know what? You can do it, but you have to do it in a different way. There's different approaches to get something done, and understanding what those approaches are.
Well, Dominic, you're one of those guys. You have such integrity, folks. I'm going to tell you, if Dominic says it's going to rain, you can set your tubs out. It's going to rain. So this guy knows what he's doing, and he'll tell you straight up. So, all right. Well, I will say that we need to wrap things up for today. I'm just telling you, folks, this is one of those that you probably need to go back and listen to. We just really scratch the surface on some things, but FDA wise, you need to get your information, following up with the FDA directly, develop those relationships. If you've got some questions, Dominic is, again, Veneziano is a good resource. And Lalo, let me ask you a question from Global Training Center perspective. There's some basic things on, different courses that you have. Is there anything related to FDA?
Only on the import class that we have. It's a full day class, but it's very limited. So what we do is when there are clients that come to us and say, "Hey, I need something more detailed," that's when we do the private, customized training, because everybody's different, just like you all have been talking about here. Cosmetics is different, medical devices is different, all that is different. And so we'll touch on those separately based on the client's requirements. So yes and no, to answer your question. There's no public scheduled courses that we do, but we do have the bandwidth and the capabilities of doing that. So.
Well, with that, Dominic, thank you again for, I think this was a very good show. I appreciate you so much as always. And, buddy, I hope you and your family are doing well, and thank you for coming on.
Andy, thank you. Lilo, thank you. And I do, Andy, I do miss our conversations. Trust me. I always enjoyed them. All the best to you both in terms of the podcast, and continue the good work.
Folks, with that, we're going to turn it back over to you. You have a great day, and thank you for your listenership.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show, or would like to sponsor Simply Trade, or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only, and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.